Hello and welcome to the first episode of the World Wide Hodge Pod. Now, this is a podcast centered around discovering the human story, which this show and I wholly believe is a global story. So, we're trying to figure out the messy recipe that is the whole cultural world phenomenon, the entire hodgepodge, right? And in this episode, from the beginning, you might have heard and recognized the sound of dice rolling. Now, this is kind of the calling card of this first month. Maybe we could call it season, or I'm not even sure what to call it yet. Point being is that the month of August is going to be centered around tabletop games, and that's going to center as the framework for this season. If you want to know more about what World Wide Hodge Pod is, who I am, and really what tabletop games mean, please head over and check out episode 0 called the August Conversation Primer. This is a 25-minute long episode that goes in depth on what this is, kind of bringing the contextualization to everything I'm saying and who I am so that we can have a better conversation. I decided against making this a full hour-long podcast between this episode and the other half, the primer part, because I think the story that I ended up finding here was far grander and more interesting than I really hoped for a first episode. So I wanted to put it on its own so that it could have a better chance of being heard. You didn't have to sit through so much introduction. But at the same time, I do heavily urge you that you check out episode 0 first, or finish listening to this and then head over to episode 0 so you can figure out what's going on here. Otherwise, without further ado, I'm Alexander Ronning. But I go by Sasha. You can find out more about me again in episode 0. Otherwise, just call me Sasha and enjoy today's story, which is centered around Ravensburg, Germany, and the board game company Ravensburger. So without further ado, let's head on an airplane out of here. Okay, I'm going to say it right away. My favorite thing of this entire process, I think, is going to be adding all the different sound effects. And depending on how crazy I go in the post-production of this episode, I apologize in advance for all the various jingles and jangles and car keys and whatever noises I decide to put in. Just know it's fun, okay? Anyways, we're beginning our story in Ravensburg, Germany. So let's start with where it's situated, right? It's in the southern region of Germany. It's right there near Switzerland, actually, on its tourist information site for English speakers is the one I accessed. They talk about how you have a beautiful scenic landscape with a view of the Alps. And between that, it's situated near Lake Constance. So you have a very scenic, idealistic type of city. Another fun fact, if you want to just throw out people, according to their information website for potential English-speaking tourists, Ravensburg is known as the city of towers and gates. I thought that was interesting. I always like to hear these slogans that kind of come up. But again, there is also a history to this city, and all I can get into that right now is that there is some really interesting architecture where their roofs slant. Instead of just a straight slant, they have this nice zigzaggy pattern. I don't know what you will take with that fact, but I found it very interesting, and I probably will link photos in the Instagram. So if you want to check out what some of these things I'm talking about, feel free to go to our Instagram page, and you'll see all the different photos of today's story. Anyways, I didn't come here to talk about Ravensburg architecture and those things. Again, there's a board game link, and the board game link is pretty easy. There's a board game company called Ravensburger, and it's a toys and games company that, funny enough, started in Ravensburg. Ravensburger Games is a huge company. It's up there with Hasbro and Mattel and the likes of that in terms of just things you might have heard of. In the tabletop games community, they've made the Disney Villainous game, which is a board game that has you play out the plots and dastardly plans of the different villains of Disney movies, and it's done very, very cleverly, and the pieces are just beautiful. Anyways, already there, Disney is an American company, United States of America company, and there is this German company making games for them, so take with that what you will. And the game is massively popular, and it's gone from its Disney animated villains tie-in to now they're making, or they have made, a Marvel edition of all the various Marvel superhero comic book villains to play out their stories in a board game fashion. One of their other more recent games that they've also created is a Minecraft based board game. Now, anybody familiar with the computer game, it was made by a Swedish man. So again, we're already seeing a few worldwide connections of this giant company that pushes all these games to you and in your life, and it's around. Of course, I think a lot of us might have, again, sorry, I don't want to speak on behalf of a lot of people. I think, at least in my personal experience, and maybe the experience of a lot of other people, they do make a lot of children's puzzles. So these 3D puzzles, you might have owned like a Ravensburger Rush Hour game, which is that classic block where you try to get this red car out of a traffic jam by moving all the other cars and trying to do that in as few moves as possible. So that's kind of where they stand. They've made a ton of others. In fact, I recently got to play with one of their really fun 3D maze games where not only do you move different pieces, but there's a layer of verticality as you try to get this marble through a almost obstacle course, I would say. Again, maybe I will link photos of what I'm talking about if you're curious. Really interesting game, really cool stuff. That's Ravensburger. And I came simply to this story through the idea that I was curious what's up with this company, right? What is the story here? To be honest, there's no patented research methodology towards this. It's the first episode. I'm trying to figure this all out. So all I really did start with is Googling up the most successful board game companies. Found Ravensburger. It was an international company. I didn't want to start with a United States of America company, even though this podcast is based in the United States of America. So I'm trying to give this an international edge already. So I'm reading through their about page. It's already kind of difficult to find. And this struck me as odd because, it should be pretty easy to find what a company is about. But I guess if you're trying to present yourself as an international brand, well, maybe the about page isn't as important. These are just my perspectives. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But just trying to put that out there. Anyways, getting to that about page brought me to the history of the company. So according to their company website, Ravensburger-group.de, the founder of Ravensburger was a man named Otto Meyer, or Meyer, one of the others, spelled Maier. And there was this one sentence really early on. It's one paragraph, maybe 3 sentences long. And so basically one sentence out of that, 33% of that entire paragraph, said that Otto Meyer was inspired by the development of educational reforms during his time, unquote. And I immediately thought that's a wholly loaded single sentence, all right? What does it mean to be inspired? What is the development of educational reforms during his time? It didn't even say what his time was. It gave a year for the founding of the company, which was 1883. So that's around during his time. You can already see the gears in my head were starting to turn. I wanted to already figure out what are these educational reforms during his time. So, of course, I got to work. And like I said, figuring out the times was easy. 1883. That's where the story begins. Well, doesn't begin, it's where we come to this first from. We need to figure out what's going on here. So it's an easy search of German educational reforms, 1880, right? Trying to get that decade to see what was going on. And immediately, it was like a kid in a candy shop. I got all the answers I needed, right? I was told Friedrich Froebel, who is this German educational reformist. And what this guy was about is, well, I'll quote him first. In his publication, The Education of Man, written in 1826, he says that, quote, "The purpose of education is to encourage and guide man as a conscious, thinking, and perceiving being in such a way that he becomes a pure and perfect representation of that divine inner law through his own personal choice. Education must show him the ways and meanings of attaining that goal," unquote. But a much cuter quote that he said is, quote, "Children are like tiny flowers. They are varied and need care, but each is beautiful alone and glorious when seen in the community of peers," unquote. That's Friedrich Froebel. He lived from the year 1782 to 1852. And like I said, kid in a candy shop from the very beginning. You get the Encyclopedia Britannica, you have the Encyclopedia of Chicago, and you have Arthur Mark K. Smith. They will all tell you what this guy is, and I've been putting this off long enough, but he is the creator of kindergarten. So, German words there, kinder, meaning kids, and Garten, I can already kind of see the English similarities, and garden. Roughly speaking, kindergarten translates to the garden of children. According to Mark K. Smith, you have to nurture the kids, and it's through this, quote, "creation of educational environments that involved practical work and the use of materials. Through engaging with the world, understanding unfolds, hence the significance of play. It is both a creative activity, and through it, children become aware of their place in the world," unquote. Roughly speaking, play leads to learning in early childhood. And if anyone's wondering, Mark K. Smith runs infed.org, in addition to just being a college professor and published author. So in case you wanted to know the credibility of the source where this information comes from, I just wanted to quickly offer that. So I think we can all agree that kindergarten kind of took off, right? I mean, South Korea, Kuwait, Morocco, and 40 other countries continue to use these ideas with a slight variance of the core idea, but kindergarten is a thing. And I apologize to do this again, but we have to talk about South Korea's age system. I think this one will just be interesting. Justin McCurry of The Guardian says, quote, "In South Korea, a baby is 1 on the day it is born and turns 2 on New Year's Day, even if it is the very next day," unquote. So I just found this really fascinating. I mean, once you are born in South Korea, you are considered 1 year old, and everybody ages at the same time on New Year's Day. So no one really knows the origins of this, and I'm not going to get into that, but it just already goes to show that there's a lot of interesting things to talk about. And one of those being, how did we even come to this concept of age? I get numbers, but at the same time, a little bit of food for thought, I think. But hear me out. This is the problem. I Googled this pretty quickly. I found what I needed to find, and I think I presented an interesting story, right? Ravensburger, look at that. Started here. He was inspired by Friedrich Froebel, right? No, not quite. You shouldn't take that as the full story or factoid. In fact, Friedrich Froebel died around 1852. Otto Meyer, the creator of Ravensburger, well, he started his company in 1883, and while publications of Friedrich Froebel's work were in publication, could have been responded to. Hey, if the sound quality sounds very different, that's because this is me during post-production. Sorry to cut the flow of everything that's going on, but I forgot to mention a really important fact. It wasn't just that his writing was in publication, it was the fact that he also did create a kindergarten in Germany. at his time to try and implement his ideas. The rest of the ideas that still follow are true and are spoken within that context, but just forgot to actually say that out loud, that he did, in fact, try his own ideas in practice. And anyways, back to the story of how I was getting rather confused about the single sentence that they put in the About page about Otto Meyer, the founder of Ravensburger. There was that whole sentence that I kept coming back to. The whole idea that he was inspired by the development of educational reforms during his time. Again, what does during his time mean? So that got me thinking a bit more. I didn't feel satisfied with what I found. And I realized why. Here's the real punch of this story, the real interesting bit, is that a lot of women stepped in to carry these ideas worldwide, the idea of kindergarten. Now, while I think it is important that somebody can write something and make it a core philosophy, I think practicality and implementation sometimes have to be factored in just as highly, and our understanding of the story is going to be informed by so many different things. And this is where the story gets messier to be able to tell. The conversation really opens up here to who matters, right? And everything that's going to be said forward isn't to say this person mattered more, this person didn't. It's simply to say that this needs to be talked about. It's not just Friedrich Froebel. It is, well, let's start. It's going to start with this lady named Margaret Schurz. And I've never heard of her. And maybe if I hadn't wanted to do a little more digging, I don't think anyone would have. And she's simply just someone who studied under Froebel. She picked up the ideas of kindergarten, and she has a sister. Pretty simple stuff. She was also a political revolutionary. She was kind of exiled from Germany after a failed revolution, where she went to stay with that sister I mentioned. Of course, that sister's name is Bertha Mayer Ronge, or Ronge, Ronge. But who's that? I mean, she's just somebody who set up a kindergarten in London. So she's out there implementing this, and her sister, now exiled, meets with her sister. I'm talking about Margaret. She moves out there, and in her exiled state, she meets a man, also exiled, and they got married. And then they decided that they'd go to America, find a new life. And after a few states, they settled into Wisconsin. And she started a kindergarten, and very casually, Margaret Schurz is credited with, by all accounts, starting the first kindergarten in the United States of America. So these German ideas pulled forward by these two sisters into London and the United States of America. Hold on to London. We're going to focus a little bit more on Margaret Schurz's story. Because in pushing to start this school to keep it alive and grow it past just family friends, she interacted with a lady named Elizabeth Peabody. Sadly, there is no connection to the Peabody Award. That would be a heck of a story, but sometimes it's not like that. But this is where this becomes national. And where I do want to give Encyclopedia Britannica a little critique. Again, in a single sentence, they say, quote, "She was probably the first woman book publisher in America," unquote, of Elizabeth Peabody. I think by the amount of time we've spent talking about everything going on now, this is the problem with a single sentence. Doesn't quite capture everything that's going on, all the different pendulums in movement, right? But at the same time, Elizabeth Peabody is credited with, in 1849, publishing a single issue of the Transcendentalist Journal titled Aesthetic Papers, and which contained, among other essays, Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. I mean, for anybody that knows that connection's made. I don't want to spend too much extra time talking about that without giving it proper research. I said the danger of a single sentence. Just know that that is a little bit of a factoid that's underdeveloped. Again, while these factoids might not always relate to the subject, it's all an important part of the circumstance that exists. So now with Elizabeth Peabody, Boston gets its own kindergarten. And once the national movement starts, well, Chicago wants to get in on it. And if you know anything about Chicago educational reform, there is a famous name of John Dewey, which is this idea of learning by doing that he's kind of promoted. The idea that if we make previous scientific findings, it will better solidify the knowledge in our head. So that's his own educational reform, which is called pragmatism. I completely did not say that. This is me, again, in post-production. But yes, the idea that I just explained that John Dewey was promoting was called pragmatism, but it was not in response solely to the ideas of kindergarten. He's figuring out higher education and all these different facets of it. So already we're seeing the messiness that is educational reform. Education spans decades of someone's life. So we are trying to understand right now what the actual educational reform matters. Anyways, back to Chicago. Chicago wasn't John Dewey. He did his own things, but back into the idea of kindergarten, we have a lady named Alice Putnam. And she makes the first kindergarten club in 1874, which gets closer to the years of Otto Mayer. Anyways, Alice Putnam, she trains 800 teachers over the next 30 years after establishing this kindergarten club. This is a lot of time and effort that paves the way for establishing free kindergartens for children who are poor. Again, her ability was to push her progressive principles of developing the whole child, not just the harmony found. And this was appealing to the settlement workers of the time. Remember, this is the 19th century, far beyond anything we recognize in today, but there are hints of life that we can recognize. Point being is Friedrich Froebel didn't just write the book and things happened. The example of Alice Putnam shows that in taking the ideas of kindergarten, she was able to mold and weave them into her own envisioning of the process, which appealed to people and actually made the idea viable. She sold the idea. And that's powerful. That causes movement. That's action. So once this happens, this begins to incorporate another name, Elizabeth Harrison, who she's another grand figure in this kindergarten movement of Otto Meyer's time, I guess, is where we're talking about. So she helped found the Chicago Kindergarten Club. So she was there with Alice Putnam. And she was soon lecturing regularly to groups of interested parents. So while Alice Putnam made the ideas viable, Elizabeth Harrison was there alongside her. This was a dual cooperation. This was multiple perspectives in action. It wasn't just the work of one person that gets name recognition. I think it's really important because I'm going to just throw in another name real quick. Susan Blow. She's, if you can imagine, a believer of kindergarten to a fault. She doesn't stray from Friedrich Froebel's teaching, and she ends up creating a school that she believes in so wholeheartedly that she runs it for 11 years without any pay. But she runs it in an orthodox style of not straying too far from the book. And it worked. I mean, her devotion to the book brings in Elizabeth Harrison, who got her training under the likes of Susan Blow. So I threw out a lot of names. I threw out a huge story that's not quite done. There is, if I can repeat all of them myself, we'll start from where we just finished. We have Susan Blow, who worked in St. Louis, Missouri, creating a kindergarten school that she believed in, that not only taught kids, but also taught future educators like Elizabeth Harrison, who from there was able to believe and incorporate her own ideas of what a kindergarten should be and how it should be taught. She went on to work with Alice Putnam together, who created the Chicago Kindergarten Club. And while Elizabeth Harrison went on to lecture and talk to groups of interested parents, Alice Putnam was able to refine the idea and fully sell it to the settlement workers of the time, not only just preach the work of theoreticals, but make it a practical manner. And I think this is where this show kind of comes in. The narrative gets sloppier now. You have to just jump over and start talking about Elizabeth Peabody, who's all the way in Boston creating her own kindergarten. There's no way to say without even more research. I mean, a whole book could be written about this, and I think you can't then link them so cleanly, Elizabeth Peabody to Alice Putnam and the rest. That's again why I'm saying that this show steps in. We all now have a slightly bigger understanding of this situation, but it is still an extremely small taste of what is going on. But again, I think most good history has a timeline to it. It's helpful to put things in perspective. And Otto Mayer started Ravensburger in 1883. Froebel died in 1852. So there's a 31-year gap between the death of Froebel, the German educational reformist, but the man who created kindergarten. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's 31 years of talk, of change, of movements pushing forward at the time, this educational reform. And again, like I said earlier, the push of people to get ideas into the world has to have some significance. Life doesn't just start with one man, right? There's a million different little moving pieces that you just pick at and you learn and you figure out and you understand better that it's all a hodgepodge, right? It's a hodgepodge of things going on. And I think that's why the story of these women was very important to touch upon. And while they might have strayed away from Germany, it just goes to show that the world has this push of it, of this interconnectedness, of this constant ebb and flow. And while one sister moved on to the United States, so Margaret Schurz, we then have the other sister, Bertha Rong. And before I even get to her, there's one new name you have to learn. Maria Kraus Boelte. I think that is how it's pronounced. So this story keeps going. And if you've seen the timestamps, you probably know that it keeps going. But this is the last bit of the clean story. So Maria Kraus Boelte was someone who went to London and taught in a kindergarten operated by one of Froebel's pupils, Bertha Rong, who was the sister of Margaret Schurz. And eventually, Bertha Rong moved on to her other life, but Maria Kraus Boelte ran the London kindergarten, and eventually, once Bertha Rong came back into the full throttle of the seat, Maria Kraus Boelte went and started her own kindergarten in Germany and had training courses. And she was such a powerful force that it connected back to Elizabeth Peabody, who brought her talents over to the United States of America to then promote the teachings of kindergarten to make it better. And that's kind of where the clean story ends. This idea of kindergarten, which is a small facet of educational reform. So before we even step out onto a macro level look of everything that's going on, there are last two names, I promise. Last two names. There's a lady by the name of Ellen Key, who is a Swedish writer. And she's kind of the future of this story. She writes from 1899 to 1920, and something that really takes a hold for her is the idea of the century of the child. This is one of her more famous publications, and Between those years I mentioned earlier, 1899 to 1910, she traveled unceasingly throughout Great Britain, Central Europe, and Italy, and visited new places, but mainly held lectures in feminist circles, build cross-border friendships, and really developing this cosmopolitan worldview. This is according to the Oxford bibliographies. So her name is something that's really hard to pinpoint down. They didn't get this big stamp of cultural approval. There weren't people fighting for her views. She was some of the shortest entries, and there was the least amount of substance to her name in the course of my research. But I hope to at least push her name out there. She was somebody talking about educational reform on this kindergarten level of young minds. But she wasn't quite responding back to kindergarten. She was doing her own thing. And just to really, really drive the point home, World Wide Hodge Pod hopes to promote this story. And while I can't cover it fully, I hope someone hears this and thinks to themselves, well, I want to tell that story, and goes about doing it. That's why I think this is important. And the future of this story also then involves Maria Montessori. She was an Italian lady. And she became specifically focused on helping children who were intellectually disabled. So her studies convinced her that the methods used to teach children, especially those with learning disabilities, were inadequate. Her works followed several ideas of how to better engage with kids, maybe through speaking engagements. She urged the creation of special classes and institutions for mentally disabled children. She also encouraged special training courses for teachers who would teach them. This is educational reform of the time. These women fit into the 19th century and everything going on. And I know that I said that this is almost coming to an end, but there's a more macro level. I have one final point to close the subject on, I guess, kindergarten educational reform. It's not that simple. There's so much to it. And again, I'm providing a small catalyst for conversation. I don't like that. Well, for me personally, the things that I came to this when I found out about all this, I did not like the idea that all of these women were lost to history. You could find them. It took so much more effort than constantly being linked back to Friedrich Froebel and his views on kindergarten. So like I said, I hope I've shown you some of the interesting bits of kindergarten educational reform that were influencing Otto Mayer probably. But finally, we got to get to the bigger macro level so that I can further prove why it's so dangerous to use a single sentence for anything. Educational reforms don't even specifically cover education in terms of schools. During the course of this research, I came across this thing called the San Quentin Prison Educational Reforms, and I've never heard of this. I didn't even know this was a thing. I didn't know you could include this in the category of things to talk about. Anyways, according to the Journal of the American Institute of Criminal Law and Criminology, you can find on page 135, and this is going to be in reference to, this was in reference to topics that were being discussed at the 8th International Prison Conference. Quote, "The reformation of the prisoner is now universally accepted as one of the principal ends of prison administration," unquote. It goes then on to say, quote, "The question opens the whole range of morale and educational influences which may be applied in prison and how far they can be adapted to different systems," unquote. This was an idea of educating prisoners as a way of reform, educational reform on the international level. This is a conference that happened in London in 1872, and since then, it has become a UN committee called the International Penal and Penitentiary Commission, the IPPC. Do I think that this led to Otto Mayer when he made his company? Was this the educational reform he was talking about? No. It's most likely to do with Friedrich Froebel, because he believed in this idea of creating toys and puzzles and games that were also very educational. when the company started out for Ravensburger, they weren't even making board games or anything. They were just making portfolios and puzzles to play with, to educate kids. They were definitely going off of this kindergarten model. But who was he in contact with? Who was he listening at the time? One single sentence will never tell you. But a quick fun fact, and I swear that this connection I never knew about before I started recording all this. The first board game that was published by Ravensburger was based off of the Jules Verne novel Around the World in 80 Days. And if that worldwide connection is not spooky, then, I have no idea. For me, it's just extremely exciting. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening towards the end. I know that there's so much left, but I hope you understand the danger of a single sentence now, because looking at the timestamp of how much this main piece took, it's about 32 minutes on my watch. And if one single sentence can hold that much, well, then I am very ready to listen to 100 more sentences. All right, now that's a wrap on episode 1. Probably going to be more like an episode 0. I'm not even sure how the numbering system is, and that's kind of the exciting bit. I know I've said so much, but we're at the forefront. So all that's left is to keep taking steps forward, to keep conversing, to keep chatting with each other, to keep figuring out what's going on in the world. What is the World Hodge Pod? I hope that this was interesting. I hope that there were things that you found good. I hope that there may be things that you found bad. And feel free to tell me. Come again over to the Twitter account and tweet at me. Tell me different things. Let's start a conversation. If that feels too much like putting yourself out there, that is a-okay. Still come over, maybe maybe retweet, figure out what works for you. And if even that is too much, if you don't want Twitter, if you don't want to come near the Twitter account, it's completely okay. Feel free to go over to our Apple podcast page or wherever you get your podcast, review it, rate it, let me know. And if, again, that doesn't feel like too much, keep listening. And that's pretty good. If you're curious about seeing any pictures about what's going on or what was being talked about today, feel free to go over to the Instagram. I'm going to post a couple of albums kind of compiling all the different faces that would have been mentioned today. Again, that's at World Hodge Pod. So world_hodge_pod, both for the Instagram and Twitter. In order to give some quick credits where credit is due, music and sound effects generally, the only sound effect I created was the dice roll that you hear at the beginning. Otherwise, all other sound effects come from Apple Loops. Most of the music you hear comes from mixkit.com. Otherwise, all production credits go to me, Sasha. It's a one-man operation, but hopefully I can include many more people in the conversation. Otherwise, just keep talking. Promote. Take a name you saw today. I'm going to probably take Margaret Schurz. Tell someone about it. Push the conversation forward. Let them know what they think. What do you think? Just get talking with someone. As long as you do it openly and honestly, you'll find that most people are down to talk to you openly and honestly. And conversation is not something to be feared. It should be something that we heavily promote. Anyways, you've heard me talk for way too long today. And I think I've heard myself talk for way too long today over the course of this and post-production. And with that, again, welcome to World Wide Hodge Pod. Please join us next week or whenever you come to this. But until then, don't forget, the human story is a global story. And we're all here trying to listen. So, see you later.